good to see everybody today. I also was going to share that we are currently searching for a 3-year appointment in Hebrew Bible because I can't teach and be dean at the same time. And we have 7 candidates that we're going to do Zoom interviews with the 1st of December. So a lot is happening at the seminary, and the framing for the new building, that what we're calling Bedford House, has started going up. So you can actually see rooms. And we've been told this is the exciting time, but after this, it'll go very slowly as they do the internal work. So lots happening. This morning, I wanted to continue. I gave you a brief little glimpse at the book of Job last Sunday. Job is one of those books that people either love or hate. Very few have a minor reaction to Job. I am one of those that have come to love Job. There are parts of it I don't like, but there are parts of it that I think are very important for us to hear in our day and time, as it was for those in the ancient Near East and around Israel. So just what we're going to do today is a little overview, and then a little bit of the structure of Job. I'll say that later. Date and authorship, some parallels to cultures around Israel, and then some theological issues. There are too many to count, but we'll try. So, just an overview. Many say that with the book of Job, we are dealing with the wisdom book par excellence. We talked about Ecclesiastes last week, and now we're going to deal with Job. It is a favorite among both Jewish and Christian scholars and lay persons. But probably the one thing most people know about Job is the patience of Job, right? And that is actually a terrible thing that we know that, because that comes from a New Testament passage in James chapter 5, verse 11. The Greek word is hippomone, which gets translated as patience, but a better rendering might be something like steadfastness. Because if you've read Job, you know he's not patient from beginning to end. He starts out there, and then he starts reacting as most of us would. So I like to think of the steadfastness of Job. The story points out right at the beginning, there was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz, that Job and his friends are not Israelites. Uz was in the land of probably Edom in the ancient times of Israel. So Job has no direct claim to the ancestral or Davidic covenants or the Sinai covenant. And you remember last week, if you were here, I said that's typical of wisdom texts, that they are not tying it to some sort of lineage, but rather this understanding that wisdom is available for all who seek it. And his friends, we'll say a bit about that, make their case not based on some of these sacred traditions, but rather on an argument of what might have been considered international wisdom. There are some of those common wisdom themes I mentioned last week. One is let me try that. Focus on creation, the importance of name or memory. Life is seen as onerous, and personification of wisdom, and also the problem of retribution, or how things work out in our world. It is a unique kind of wisdom. Some say it's a crisis of wisdom, and often seen as being included in the Hebrew Bible as a rebuttal to the kind of you reap what you sow theology that we see throughout, especially Joshua and Judges and on down the line through the Kings. So, and also in Proverbs, which we didn't look at last week. So, a couple of things about its connections to the neighbors of Israel. We don't think Job is originally born out of Israel. The name Job is not a typical Israelite name. As I mentioned, he's associated with the land of Uz, probably Edomite or Aramean territory. So what we think is that these extra-biblical parallels were known by the compilers of Job, and they borrowed some elements, but then told the story in a way that reflected Israel's views of who the holy was, and that God is the person or the deity that Job serves. There's one text called A Man and His God. That is a Sumerian text. There's another one called the Babylonian Theodicy. And there's also one on a suffering person in another culture. And it ends up that I mentioned last week, I think briefly, that in all these parallels, there's a lot of like Job. It's a righteous sufferer who did nothing to deserve what he's experiencing. But in all those parallels, unlike the end of Job, the God they worship, the God they're complaining to, never shows up to respond. That is a unique feature of the book of Job. So again, not that Israel copied. This isn't a plagiarism case. This is just the idea that cultures, as they encountered one another, shared traditions and texts. And there's probably not been a human community around on this earth that didn't worry about why bad things happen to good people. It's just one of those big questions of life. Theological issues in Job. There are many, many, many. Most see Job, and I'm sorry that print came out smaller than I thought, as answering the question of theodicy, which means defending God, defending of God. Theodicy is that how do we explain if we have a wonderful, loving, compassionate God, why then do people suffer for things they had no control over? And this can be as broad as victims of flooding and tornadoes, or more specifically, things like diseases, even war, the victims of war. And so, interestingly enough, with Job, in the end, there is no answer to this question. Most people want an answer, and it doesn't give us an answer because there really isn't a simple answer. Another idea, as I mentioned, is we read throughout these texts, beginning particularly in Joshua and going all the way through, that if you do right, you are blessed. If you do wrong, you are punished. That's how they explained everything. So whenever someone was suffering, the first question people would ask is, what did they do wrong? And we'll see that in the book of Job in Job's friends. But that did not work in all situations in life. And even if we read more carefully those other books of the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't quite work as neatly as it sounds on the surface. So, another thing is the question of why are we faithful? And to me, this is a really great question to ask. Are we being faithful to get the cheese at the end of the maze? Heaven, whatever you want to call that. Or are we faithful simply because that's what the Holy calls us to be? Regardless of any reward or special treatment, but rather that's who we're called to be. Another question that comes up is that Job is portrayed as righteous and blameless. But some people have argued, is any human being purely blameless? Can any of us claim that we didn't do anything wrong in our life? I am not a fan of that kind of approach to Job because I think it misses the point of the whole story. A righteous person who suffers from many ills, but is not one who is seen to answer that question of What did you do wrong to deserve this? And then another piece that I really like to talk with seminary students about is, what is a proper response to suffering? We will talk a little bit later about Job's friends and how they responded to Job. In the beginning, they sit quietly with Job in his suffering. But when Job starts to ask questions, they are quick to provide answers and reasons for why he has suffered. That's where they go wrong. And I think many of us have this impetus when we see someone suffering to give an explanation for it, probably for our own well-being. We're trying to figure out why. But usually the people who are in the midst of the greatest suffering don't need us to try and explain to them why this is happening. In ministry, we talk about the ministry of presence, where you are with someone in suffering and not trying to explain it away. And then also a question of divine omniscience and human freedom. Does God know what we're going to do before we do it? Or does God know that we have free will and won't know how we're going to act until we finally do? Maybe God can see all the potential, but we have a choice that we make each time. So is God truly omniscient, all-knowing? And throughout the Hebrew Bible, this is not a dominant view of God. It might be in many Christian traditions, but in the Hebrew Bible, there's this sense that maybe when God made the choice to give freedom to humans to make choices, God has to wait to see how we act as well. This is really small, but I wanted you just to see a visual. You don't need to read it. But it's the visual of the structure of Job. And you can just see it. You can see that there's an opening section, and then you see 3 sections. Then you see over here another section, and the closing. If you could read those, it would say the prologue, which is chapters 1 through chapter 2, verse 13. Then there is what we call the dialogue, where Job and his friends are talking. That's between chapters 3 and 42. Then there is this new character that comes into the story by the name of Elihu that engages Job as trying to do what the other friends couldn't do, make the case that Job deserved what he was getting. That's from 32 to 37. And then that piece that I said is missing in the other cultural examples is the divine encounter, when God shows up. That's chapters 38 through 42, verse 6. And then the epilogue, the wrap-up, is chapter 42, verses 7 through 17. The other thing that this doesn't quite show, but Job is like a sandwich. It has 2 prose pieces, and in the middle is all this poetry. And if you read the first couple of chapters and read the end of chapter 42, you have a complete story. A righteous sufferer never curses God, gets everything back and then some, and it lives happily ever after. It's in the in-between, the poetic sections, that many think maybe were added by Israel later, that we get some of the bigger questions. So one theory is that there was a folk tale about a man named Job who was righteous, and all this happened, and then he was rewarded. And someone came along and said, that's too simplistic. Let's do something else. And so they added all this poetic conversation. It's no way to prove that, But it is an intriguing theory, and that section at the top of the second page, where this new person, Elihu, comes in, some people think was actually an even later addition to the story of Job. As I said, this new guy tries to argue, and he's also a young guy. He thinks his elders have not done well, so he makes his own case for Job's suffering. So many think there were stages of development that got us to what we have as the book of Job now. So let's start with that first prologue section. It's divided into 6 scenes, and the division is based on where the scene is taking place. What's the setting? So the first scene starts on earth, and we meet Job, a man righteous and blameless before the Lord, who is from the land of Uz, who has all these children, and the children used to get together at one of the sons' homes, and they'd celebrate, and Job would worry that they might have done something wrong, so he would go the next day and make sacrifices on their behalf because Job is such a blameless guy. Then the next scene takes place in heaven. We get to see the divine council has gathered together, and we're wondering, what is this divine council? Well, in this particular part of Job, and we see it in Psalms and a couple other places, there is a sense that God has gathered, however you want to imagine them, whether they are angels, messengers. Some cultures would say they were sub-deities. Now, Israel was monotheistic, so that doesn't quite work. But they come before God for like a board meeting or a Monday morning staff meeting. And among those gathered is this character called Ha-Satan. So I'm going to jump through this a minute because I want to get to who is Ha-Satan. This is the biggest piece to understand these first 2 chapters. In the Hebrew Bible, it appears in just this way, Ha-Satan. Ha is the definite article the. And Satan can have a very big range of meanings. But what I know for certain, this is not a proper noun. Because you don't say the Lisa. Well, some people might want to say the Lisa. But in Hebrew, if there is a definite article before a noun, that means it's not a name. So in many of our translations, when we read this section, it has Satan with a capital S. But that's not accurate to the Hebrew Bible. Why? Because actually, the Hebrew Bible doesn't have a sense of a devil like we get in Christianity. And here's why. If God is all-powerful and the source of all things, then you can't have a devil who would try and take power away from God. The word Ha-Satan or Satan occurs several places throughout the Hebrew Bible. Sometimes it describes a human being, and sometimes it describes heavenly beings. But we think the word Satan means accuser or adversary. This may be some sort of a legal idea, the accuser, or it could be personal or political. But Ha-Satan is a role, not a name. And notice that in the book of Job, Ha-Satan is gathered among the divine council. Later on, we think, particularly in the post-exilic period, after the Israelites had experienced the Persian religion, which had an idea of a good God and a bad God, that the idea of Ha-Satan started to trickle in as another kind of sub-deity. So you could blame bad things on Ha-Satan and good things only from God. But that's a much later development. Rather, Ha-Satan has this sense of one who is maybe working on behalf of God to see if human beings are being faithful. Maybe the role of Hasatan is to accuse folks or to show to the holy, report on those who are not being faithful to God. In Zechariah 3:1, we see where Joshua, not the Joshua of the book of Joshua, but another Joshua, is on trial in heaven before the angel of the Lord. And Hasatan stands on the right hand to accuse Joshua for the places where he has not been faithful. So this Hasatan is a subordinate. Actually, I think the role of Hasatan is to defend God's honor. Sort of like the prosecuting attorney when you find someone who's not being faithful. And so Hasatan shows up to tell God what Hasatan has been doing. So again, I know that's a little weird because sometimes we don't understand that Satan in the Bible, in the New Testament, really isn't the Jewish concept of what we have in the Hebrew Bible. So I want to go back to these scenes. So we go to heaven, and the council gathers, and the holy says to Hasatan, "Hey, what you been up to lately?" And Hasatan says, "I've been roving back and forth across the earth, checking on people to see if they're faithful." And the holy says, "Have you noticed my servant Job? How faithful he is. There's a righteous person." Now, if God had not said anything about Job, the story would end right there. But because God calls attention to how faithful Job is, Hasatan says, "Well, look, no wonder he's faithful. Everything good happens to him. He's wealthy, he has children, his life is a life of ease. But if you let evil befall him, if you let bad things happen to him, he will curse you because of that." That's a challenge. Hasatan saying, just how faithful is this guy Job? And I don't know about you, but at this point I want God to say, well, I know Job's faithful. Who's going to report the next thing? But God says, I'll take that bet. Go do whatever you want to Job, except don't harm his physical self. And so the scene ends. And we jump back to earth. And on earth, Job is, minding his own business. And all of a sudden, things start happening. He loses all his animals. He loses all his servants. And ultimately, his children are killed. They're all together in that house having a feast, and the children are killed. And every time one of these bad things befalls Job, you get one messenger coming to Job saying, "You're never going to believe what happened. I alone have survived." And then here comes another messenger telling the next bad thing, "And I alone have survived." So I think there's a little kind of humor trying to get in there, even though it's not a humorous subject. And so when Job learns all the bad things that have happened, he doesn't curse God, but maintains his faith. Of course, going into mourning, but maintains his faith. So that then we hop back up to heaven, another Monday morning staff meeting for the divine council, and God says to Hasatan, "Have you noticed my servant Job? He's still faithful. Told you so." And then Hasatan says, "Yeah, but what if you harm him? Take away his health." Once again, I want the holy to say, "Yeah, I'm not going there." But because of how the story works, God says, "Sure, go and do what you want to Job, but don't kill him." And so back to earth we go, and Job is struck with sores, terrible sores, maybe leprosy, something else. And he's so miserable. He's sitting on an ash heap and he's scratching himself with a pottery shard, just suffering greatly. Well, for the first time, we see Job's wife. Now think about this. When Job lost all the stuff he lost, she lost it too. When the children were killed, she lost them too. And so she comes along and says to Job, look, still you maintain your faith after all this? Just curse God and die. Now, a lot of people are not happy with Job's wife, but I think there are a couple of ways of looking at this. One, remember, she has lost everything. And where is Job? Sitting on an ash heap, scratching himself. While she's trying to carry on with life. Who's going to take care of all the things that have to happen? And she has no resources now. So there's one image of her that I have of her walking up and just get this over with, curse God and die. Another way that some scholars look at it is that she sees how badly Job is suffering, and it's kind of that merciful death kind of idea. Just go ahead, do it so maybe you can be put out of your misery. But still Job persists in his faith. It says, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And that's the conclusion of that first prologue. So, Job's sitting on an ash heap, suffering physically, mourning what he's lost, and along comes his three friends. They've heard what's happened to Job. They see him from a distance, and he is such a pitiful character that they are overcome with grief and shock. And so what do? They go and sit with him on the ash heap and let him mourn with them. But then Job speaks up, starts out, cursed be the day I was born. The day they said a man-child has been born. It'd be better if I'd never lived than to suffer these things, and I did nothing wrong to suffer these things. Well, then the friends can't keep quiet any longer. And they start telling Job everything he did. You must have missed something on the checklist. Maybe you didn't give enough money here, or you didn't do the right thing there, but there's got to be a reason for why you're suffering. Well, I'm pretty harsh on the three friends, I'll admit it. But then I put myself in their shoes. Imagine the person you know who is the best example of a person of faith, who is ethical and righteous and all those things, and then this horrific situation befalls them. I imagine that the friends are like, oh gosh, if that can happen to Job, what could happen to me? If this can happen to Job, then why should I be faithful anymore? What is this? And so I think when they start talking, they're really trying to comfort themselves, to find a reason behind the suffering, to explain so that their world still makes sense. And so they go back and forth, and as I showed, there's 3 cycles of each friend telling Job what he must have done to deserve this, and Job speaking about how God has, put a bullseye on my back. I did nothing. I do these things. And this goes on and on and on. And again, we're talking about different explanations for theodicy. Did something bad happen to Job because he did something to deserve it? Or did something bad happen to Job because bad things happen to good people? Then after the three friends have gone round and round and round and have not seemed to convince Job that he did something to deserve this, as I said, along comes this new character, Elihu, who is a young whippersnapper, who has listened to all these arguments and thinks that the other three friends have failed to get to the right point. So he too begins to explain to Job that you had to do something for this to happen to you. Have to. You cannot be righteous and innocent and suffer in the way you're suffering. Then, after Elihu gets done, nothing's settled. And as I said, this isn't a dialogue. They are talking past each other, talking for their own sake. Job is mostly engaging God and saying, really, God, what's going on? And the friends are dealing with their own stuff. So that when we get to chapter 38, God shows up in a whirlwind. And finally, we think we're going to get an answer. God's going to come and say, this is why you're suffering. I want you to know. But that's not what happens when God shows up. God's first response is like, who are you to be saying these things and misrepresenting me and doing all this stuff? And you know what? Who was the last person who spoke before God shows up? Well, if you read the text carefully, it was Elihu. So who is God responding to at this point? Could it be that God's response is to these friends who have been trying to tell Job how he deserved this, talking about God as if they know God's own mind? And God's first response is not pleasant. Now, if it's Job that God's responding to, I can get that as well. But I think it's interesting that the last person who speaks before God responds is not Job. So after God's response, Job speaks up and says, no, this doesn't make sense. And so once again, God shows up again. And God goes on this lovely speech about consider the birds and the oceans and the great sea monsters and all these things that I have made, and how I am the one who causes rain and causes this and causes that, but still doesn't answer the question. God doesn't give an answer. And to me, that's a little surprising. And sometimes I imagine God is filibustering, if you will. I don't know about you, but sometimes when I was getting on my mom's last nerve, or I wanted to know why something happened and she didn't want to tell me why something happened, she'd say, look at all I've done for you. I have been busy doing clothes. I've got you a hot dinner on the table, and look at this and this and this. And God is just trying not to answer Job's question. But why? Why doesn't God answer? Well, my thought is, would it help Job if God said, well, I took this bet with Hasatan and let all these bad things happen to you just to prove that you were faithful? Somehow I don't think that would make Job feel better. But even without an answer, at least God shows up. God has listened, God has heard, and then what happens? Job responds. And this is the response that you get in the NRSV and the NIV. I despise myself and repent upon dust and ashes. So what does that make it sound like? That Job is saying, I was wrong? The question? I despise myself? Another translation by Norman Havel. I retract my words and repent of dust and ashes. Well, that makes it sound like Job's like, okay, I dropped my case. I'm going to go on. Another is, I reject and forswear dust and ashes. Maybe this is Job moving on. Okay, I've been heard. Didn't get an answer, but I'm going to move on. Another one said, I retract my words and have changed my mind concerning dust and ashes, the human condition. Maybe Job does now figure out, maybe I did do something wrong, or I'm never going to get the answer I want. Another one, I retract my words and am comforted concerning dust and ashes. This makes it sound like maybe Job is at least comforted that God has heard all his complaints. And then another one says, I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes. So calling to mind that creation story where we're made out of dirt. And saying, I recant, I relent. I'm just a human. I'm never going to get it. And then there's this one scholar who looked at the text, and there's no verb there that translates despise. Not a single one. The verbs and the words cannot say, I despise myself. Not only is there not a verb for that, it is not a reflexive verb in Hebrew. There's a certain kind of ending that you look for a reflexive verb. But it seems to me the best we can get is I reject and regret dust and ashes. Now you're like, well, Lisa, that doesn't answer anything for us at all. But here's my thought. My thought is that Job just says, uncle. I'm not going to get the answer, but I got to get on with living. So I'm going to give up on the dust and ashes. I'm just going to go back to life, which hopefully he'll help his wife who's been dealing with all this all by herself. Because I think Job is really just realizing, I'm not going to get what I want, but I've been heard, and I'm going to leave and go back. I used to teach a class in Kentucky for lay ministers, and one year we did the book of Job. And when I teach Job like that, I usually have them do a trial, where Job puts God on trial for behavior unbecoming a deity or a variety of other things. And usually they argue it out to the end, and we try to figure out who won. We have a jury, all that. This one class, they thought they were so smart. They had Job get up for the closing arguments, and he said, I withdraw my case, and walked away. And for a moment I was kind of stunned. But then I thought, that's really what the story is saying. I made my case, it didn't go anywhere, I withdraw it, and on I go. So that when we turn to the conclusion of Job, we hear this. God then says to Job's friends that they have been wrong, and only Job can sacrifice on their behalf for them to be forgiven. Now, if Job was wrong for arguing with God, then how can Job be the one who has to do the sacrifice for the 4 friends to not be held accountable, to be forgiven? That's an amazing image. It says to me Job was right all along. The friends weren't getting it right. So he does this sacrifice, and the friends are forgiven. And then we get the conclusion of the story. It's an all's well that ends well kind of ending, a Hollywood ending, if you will, or is it? Job gets the following, in my opinion, for compensatory damages. He had 7,000 sheep, he gets 14,000 sheep. He had 3,000 camels, he gets 6,000 camels. He gets 1,000 he had 500 yoke of oxen, now 1,000, and 500 donkeys, and now 1,000 donkeys. Isn't that a little overboard? Doesn't it sound like God's trying to compensate a little bit for what has happened? Oh, I forgot one piece that we often overlook. Before he gets all this back, it says Job's friends and family show up at his house. And I think immediately of when there's a death in the family and people show up with food and anything else. So maybe Job getting all this stuff back is really because the community finally responded. And it makes me wonder, where were they to begin with? Well, sometimes we do tend to stay away from tragedy because it's so painful for us. But the community finally shows up. He gets everything back. Oh, and he gets 7 sons, which is what he had to begin with, and 3 daughters, which is what he had to begin with. Notice he doesn't get back twice as many children, because that would be really, really not appropriate. You can't replace and double children for the ones he's already lost. And the really intriguing part is the story says he has 3 daughters, and they are the most beautiful women in the entire land. And we get their names: Jemima, Keziah, and Karen Hapuk. And you've probably heard me say more than once, we don't get many women's names in the Hebrew Bible, but we get these 3 daughters, and how beautiful they are. Oh, and Job gives them an inheritance equal to their brothers. Makes me wonder, now that Job has suffered and knows what it's like not to have wealth, could it make him a little bit more compassionate for his daughters who probably wouldn't inherit from their father's wealth, only the sons? Possibility. And then the story goes with, after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children 4 generations. And Job died old and full of days. The end, right? Happily ever after. Except that, I'm always the one who throws a wrench in the mix. I was struck by this. He died old and full of days. So I did a little searching. And there are only 2 other people in the Hebrew Bible who are described as dying old and full of days. One of them happens to be King David. Now, you may not remember, but he dies a shriveled old man with trying to stay warm with this young Abishag, trying to keep him warm. His whole kingdom is splitting apart with his sons fighting with each other in order to see who would take the throne. That wasn't a happy ending for the great David. The other person, Isaac. Think about Isaac. Your father tried to kill you and blamed it on God. By the end of his life, he seems rather feeble. He is blind now, and his sons are fighting with each other, and he gets tricked into blessing one son over the other. He didn't die happily ever after. And I think this might be the storyteller's way of giving us an inside scoop. Yes, Job lived a long time with stuff that came back to him, and he saw his children and his children's children, but I don't think Job ever got over what happened. I think this is the storyteller letting us know that Job was never quite the same. How could he be? Old and full of days wasn't necessarily the best ending for a human being. Maybe Job had a whole different understanding of God after all this has happened to him. Questions? Comments? I know we have a few more minutes. Yes, sir.
Well, assuming God is omnipotent, which we all do, really this whole chapter begins with kind of a bet. Like, let's put this guy through the paces and see if he stands up. God already is omnipotent. Why would he agree to that?
As I said, in the Hebrew Bible, God is not assumed to be omnipotent. And I don't assume God to be omnipotent either, so throw tomatoes later, not right now. But I do believe God has to wait to see how humans are going to act. Now, to answer your question, if God knew everything, then that makes God look twice as cruel in some ways, because God let Job suffer for nothing. I think God believed and thought Job was faithful, but God had to see it play out in the story. I'm not talking about God that we believe in. I'm talking about God as a character in the story at this point. I also think one message I take from that is that God has faith in us. God has faith that we can be good even if our life is not blessed. That's a pretty big statement of faith. That we humans can do the right thing because it's the right thing. That we will be good people because that's what God asks of us. But in your question, yes, if God knew that it was going to end this way, then God shouldn't have taken the bet to begin with. So that's one of those puzzlers of this story. And as I said, for the people who produce this story, I think they're portraying a God who doesn't know what's going to happen all the time.
Also, it's confusing that when he's queried about what this all about, it says he responds as in a whirlwind.
Yeah.
So who's confused here?
Well, that's often a way of showing God. God can show up in natural events. You know, the wind that blows, a still small voice. God shows up in a variety of ways. But as I said, that first response, if God is responding to the friends, I think God is upset because they've tried to say that Job was to blame for this. So I think that's the way they image Job standing there and a whirlwind comes and hears a voice. Just like Moses sees a burning bush that's not consumed by the flames and a voice comes out of it. In that ancient culture, natural phenomena were often believed to be signs of a divine presence. As I said, it's not an easy book. It doesn't have simple answers. Unless we see it as I said, one way of responding to suffering. Let's stay with the friends and sit. Let's not try and explain or tell people what they should be feeling. Unless it is a sense of, like I said, for me, in the fiction of the story or the storyteller's version, God says, I know Job will be right and will be faithful for the right reasons. So I'll take that bet, which, as I said, shows God having faith in Job. That Job is righteous not because his life is perfect, but he's righteous because that's who God calls us to be. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah?
You know, I think of how often... Okay. I think of how often I'm reading the sports page and I read about some high school kid that says, I'm following God's plan for me. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, gee, that's kind of... So this goes on constantly where everything's a plan of God. Mm-hmm. We all know somebody that found a parking spot and said, God opened that parking spot for me. So I think this is a real good counter to that aspect of life.
Yeah.
Philosophical.
Yes. And I find it comforting to say that while I get to make my choices, ultimately the Holy is in control. But not in the way that I might want the Holy to be controlling me. Like the fact that TCU beat OSU last night or yesterday. I will not blame God for that. But you knew I had to say it. Come on, people. It's TCU, and we beat OSU soundly. Okay, I know I may need an armed escort out the door. Pardon me? If I get out the door. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Do you think compensatory damages might have had an element of punitive damages because of the excessiveness of what it appeared the compensatory the compensatory damages were, thinking God maybe thought, maybe I was pretty hard on this guy. Maybe I ought to give him more, considerably more, as a form of punitive damages on God.
Yeah, I guess I'm not a legal person. I just thought of compensatory, God overcompensating. But my understanding is, yes, I think God feels a little bad about all this a lot bad about all this happening. And so God blesses Job even more. Excessive is a good word for it. Also remember, I think at the beginning when it's saying he has this many camels and sheep, etc., that's a way of showing his incredible wealth. Nobody would have had that much back then. But this is certainly God saying, all right, I'll give you what you had and a little bit more, but not children. All right, thank you all.
One more thing, don't you think that it also helps us, maybe in a real superficial way, when we see people suffering, not to be judgmental about coming to a conclusion that, well, they must have done this, or...
Yes.
Because I still think that's a prevalent thought process.
Yes.
With a lot of guilt.
I think so too. And yes, I don't think we should ever jump to conclusions. And it's probably, again, best to follow the friend's example and be with them in their suffering. And then be like the community, showing up so that their suffering can be somehow survivable. Never going to get over it. All right, thank you all very much.